So, inshallah, today I'd like to continue and hopefully wrap up our discussion about the example to explain examples in the Quran. I talked about some of those things yesterday with you from Surah Al-Baqarah. Just to do a quick, easy translation of the ayah so it's fresh in our minds again. إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يَسْتَحْيِي أَنْ يَضْرِبَ مَثَلًا مَا. It's not Allah for sure that is ashamed in any way that He may strike an example of any kind whatsoever. بَعُوضَةً فَمَا فَوْقَهَا. Even a mosquito or anything even more far-fetched. فَمَا فَوْقَهَا. فَأَمَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا فَيَعْلَمُونَ أَنَّهُ الْحَقُّ مِنْ رَبِّهِمْ. And then as for those who have faith, they certainly know that it is true or purposeful from their Rabb, from their Master. وَأَمَّا الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا فَيَقُولُونَ مَاذَا أَرَادَ اللَّهُ بِهَذَا مَثَلًا. And as for those who disbelieve, then they're the ones who say, what does God intend, what does Allah intend with this as an example? يُضِلُّ بِهِ كَثِيرًا وَيَهْدِي بِهِ كَثِيرًا. By means of this example itself, Allah allows many to be misguided, and by the same example, Allah allows many to be guided. وَمَا يُضِلُّ بِهِ إِلَّا الْفَاسِقِينَ. And He doesn't allow anyone to be misguided except those that are corrupt, al-fasiqeen. And then the next ayah, which I'll translate a little bit later, is the definition of the fasiqeen. Interestingly, in the order of the Quran, fasiq, I said corrupt. This will be the first definition in the order of the Quran as we have it of who is corrupt. So that's a really interesting piece of this puzzle also. And we'll have to look at corruption and its relationship with examples, because we're actually here to study the examples, and yet Allah tied this someone's lack of understanding or dismissal of the examples with corruption, which you would not think is one and the same thing, right? But let's pick up from some of the things we left out from yesterday and try to complete that picture. The thing I want to start with today is to help all of us internalize that nothing in the Quran is commenting on a reality that is dead, meaning it happened, it's never going to happen again. The Quran is talking about recurring realities. And speaking of that, this is going to be a commentary on the word al-haq, which is a key term in this ayah that we're going to study. Because the believers, when they hear the example, they know it is al-haq. يَعْلَمُونَ أَنَّهُ الْحَقُّ مِنْ رَبِّهِمْ, right? So let's understand some things about al-haq. In the Arabic sense, al-haq means many things. First of all, it does mean reality. Reality. Al-haqqun huwa, is it real? Alaysa hadha bihaq? On Judgment Day, kuffar will see the punishment and a sarcastic question will be asked, isn't this haq? Is this real enough for you? قَالُوا بَلَا وَرَبِّنَا. Then they testify, of course it is, right? So haq refers to reality. Haq also refers to purpose. So Allah says, خَلَقَ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضَ بِالْحَقِّ. He created the skies and the earth purposefully. And the word for purposefully is al-haq also. It also means justification. So if something is rightful, something is justified, then it's haqqa alayhi or huqqa alayhi even. So it has multiple meanings. But I'm going to stick with one of them for now, or one or two, reality and purpose. So let's first talk about reality. How do human beings observe reality? How do we understand reality around us? We understand reality through patterns. A child does not know the reality of a sharp object until they experience it, and maybe they forget and they touch it again and they experience the prick again and again, and then, okay, now you know what, the reality has settled in, right? The reality, or all of our knowledge, all of our understanding of reality comes from learning, and learning can only happen through repetition. Words are repeated to a child over and over and over again until they understand the reality of its meaning and they can regurgitate them and understand them. Even, for babies, even before they respond to you, they can start understanding you, right? Even before they learn how to say the word, they've heard the word so many times, they know the reality of its meaning, right? And in science, to discover something, you conduct experiments and experiments and experiments, and then one of the times it worked. But that's not enough. You have to be able to repeat the experiment multiple times before you could say this is real, it's not a fluke. So reality comes from something that is recurring. Now, the believer hears the example and Allah says, يَعْلَمُونَ أَنَّهُ الْحَقُّ مِنْ رَبِّهِمْ. They hear the example and they immediately know that this is haqq from their Rabb. If it's reality, it means Allah is not just describing a singular incident, He's describing something that has a formula inside it, and so long as those same ingredients are applied, the same result will occur. This is a reality that is being described. So the example is not just some one interesting thing, some abstract thing, it's actually a way to understand the world. This is a larger subject. I know I don't want to get too abstract with you, but it's an important piece of understanding the Quran. The Quran isn't just talking about spiritual reality. The Quran isn't just talking about legal reality, or it isn't just talking about psychological or emotional reality. The Quran is talking about multiple dimensions of reality. Depends on where you are in the Quran. And for example, one of the aspects of reality Allah talks about that's often not understood, Allah talks about the reality of human individuals, and He also talks about the reality of human societies. Like human beings have a cycle from childhood to adolescence to teenage years to adulthood to old age, and there's a cycle, and there are certain tendencies we have at each of those stages, certain common denominators. Allah will talk about that reality. Allah will talk about the common overwhelming desires human beings have. زُيِّنَ لِلنَّاسِ حُبُّ الشَّهَوَاتِ مِنَ النِّسَاءِ وَالْبَنِينَ, etc. Right? That's at the individual level. But Allah also describes the life cycles of nations. What happens to a nation when it's at its top? What happens when it falls? There's formulae given in the Quran. And Allah is not just talking about some ancient nation that happened to. If you carefully study that, you can extract from it the formula. So the experiment is actually not the goal. The experiment is there to prove the formula. So what the Quran does is, if you contemplate, it's showing you the case study. But from the case study, you're supposed to extract the formula, and once you have the formula in your hand, now you can look at any other scenario and say, does this formula apply here? Does it apply here? Does it apply here? Right? So it's actually these sets of principles that allow you to see reality in a very different way. It gives you a set of tools that can be used over and over and over again once you have them, right? So this is actually what al-haq embodies. Once you understand reality a certain way, you have a tool, you have a way by which you can see through what is real and what is fake. How to recognize an enemy, how to recognize a friend, how to recognize a nation on the rise, how to recognize a nation on the fall, etc., etc. Right? So that's فَأَمَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا فَيَعْلَمُونَ أَنَّهُ الْحَقُّ مِنْ رَبِّهِمْ. Just on the reality side of things. The other piece of that is purpose. Al-haq also means purpose. Allah never gives an example unless it has a purpose. And He gave it in the final revelation because it will continue to have purpose until we leave this earth. In other words, no example is ever going to be irrelevant to our condition. Like, even if it's an example of a mosquito and you're like, I don't live in a tropical country and we don't have a mosquito problem. We're not in Houston. We have a much lesser mosquito problem in Dallas, so it's not that big of a deal here or whatever. No. Or I'm in Antarctica, or I live in Alaska and they freeze to death over there, so we don't have a mosquito problem. It's not relevant to me. You're missing the point. The point isn't the mosquito. The point is the formula behind it. And that's going to live and that will always have a purpose. That will always have an application. And the believer sees that and they know that. Now, but there's a deeper problem. Allah says about the believer, even if you give the example of a mosquito, فَأَمَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا فَيَعْلَمُونَ أَنَّهُ الْحَقُّ مِنْ رَبِّهِمْ. Those who believe, they already know it is purposeful and real from their Rabb. So Allah is talking about something very meaningful, purposeful, and He's commenting on reality in some way. He's not commenting on some abstract philosophical thing, He's commenting on reality. How do you know that before even understanding it? Like when you hear about the mosquito, you don't even know what the purpose of that is, but you know it's purposeful. You know what the Western academic calls that? They call that a faith bias. You don't even know what it is yet, but you already know it's true. How can you know it's true until you analyzed it, critiqued it, evaluated it, and eventually came to the conclusion that it's true? But before all of that experimentation, you already know that it's true? How come? Allah is talking about this because we are in the Madani Quran. And the Madani Quran is sitting on the foundation of the Makki Quran. And the Meccan Quran established why should you believe? Why should you become a believer to begin with? Once you understand that, why should I accept these words as the words of God? Once that is set, On top of that come the examples. On top of that come the examples. If that isn't set, if that foundation isn't there, then your response will be, what am I going to learn from a mosquito? What do you get from the kuffar? فَأَمَّا الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا فَيَقُولُونَ مَاذَا أَرَادَ اللَّهُ بِهَذَا مَثَلًا. It's as if Allah is saying, Iman is almost a precondition to get what you need to get out of the examples. Iman has to already be there for you to learn from the examples. You have to believe in the value coming from this teacher, the ultimate teacher, Allah Himself, before you can benefit from the lesson. As simple as that. فَأَمَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا فَيَعْلَمُونَ أَنَّهُ الْحَقُّ مِنْ رَبِّهِمْ. From a language perspective, there's the word amma here. And it occurs amma doesn't occur once, it always occurs twice. فَأَمَّا وَأَمَّا أَمَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَأَمَّا الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا. But there were easier ways to say this. You know, in Arabic we say خَيْرُ الْكَلَامِ مَا قَلَّ وَدَلَّ. The best way to say something is to use the least amount of words. So you could say يَعْلَمُ الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا أَنَّهُ الْحَقِّ. The believers know it's true. وَقَالَ يَقُولُ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا مَاذَا أَرَادَ اللَّهُ. And the disbelievers say, what does Allah intend? But أَمَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا فَيَعْلَمُونَ. It's extended. And then وَأَمَّا الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا فَيَقُولُونَ. It's extended again. Why extend this? This is a rhetorical device to say these two groups of people are polar opposites. They're far apart from each other. There's no, sometimes there's people that are Democrats, some people are Republicans, and some people are Democrats in some things and Republicans in other things. A little bit of a mix in between, right? Some people are conservative, some people are liberal, and some things they're not that conservative and the liberals not that liberal. That happens. But Allah is describing two groups of people that have no overlap. They are on extreme opposite ends. There's no in between when it comes to this. There's no compromise, there's no middle group when it comes to this. So Allah is actually drawing a very hard line between these two groups that approach the examples that Allah gives, the mindset that Allah gives. This is important to note because then for you and me, we better make sure we're on the right side of this camp because there's no in between. I'm kind of sorta in the middle. There's no sorta in the middle when it comes to this distinction. فَأَمَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَأَمَّا الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا. Okay. Then another important observation. And that is that when Allah talked about the believers, Allah said, يَعْلَمُونَ. They know. They know. But when He talked about the disbelievers, He didn't say they know. He said they say. يَقُولُونَ. Allah could have said, when believers hear the example, they say it's the truth. And when disbelievers hear it, they say, what does Allah mean? They say, they say. But for believers, they know. And for disbelievers, what? They say. Why? Knowing is internal, isn't it? Knowing is internal. Allah is not describing the external of the believer. Allah is describing the internal of the believer. The internal state is being highlighted. But for the disbeliever, it's as if Allah is saying that they didn't really go through an internal process. They didn't allow anything internal to actually activate before they opened their mouth. For them, it's an impulsive response. They just come out and what? Say. So it's the mouth moving that's been highlighted. يَقُولُونَ. What's also really interesting is that Allah didn't say فَيَسْأَلُونَ مَاذَا أَرَادَ اللَّهُ. What did the disbelievers say? They said, what does Allah intend by this as an example? But when you say, what does Allah intend? Isn't that a question? That's a question. The word for that should be يَسْأَلُونَ. They ask, what does Allah intend? Allah didn't say they ask, what does Allah intend? Allah says, they say, what does Allah intend? What in the world? Why would He say the word say and not say the word ask? What could we learn from that? You see, when somebody asks, they want to know the answer. When somebody says, they just want to make a comment. For example, you're about to leave the house and your mother looks at you and says, you're going to wear that? Are you really wearing that? She says that. Is she asking or saying? She's not asking. She's saying, go change. You understand? When you say, even if it's a question, it's not really a question, it's sarcastic. And this is a common occurrence in the Quran. By the way, يَسْأَلُونَكَ in the Quran, يَسْأَلُونَكَ مَاذَا يُنْفِقُونَ. They ask, what should we spend? That's actually a question. قل ما أنفقتم من خير. يسألونك عن اليتامى. They ask you about the orphans. قل إصلاح لهم خير. They tell them doing good among them is a good thing. يسألونك عن الشهر الحرام قتال فيه. They ask you about the sacred months. Can we fight in it? Those are genuine questions. But then when Muslims had a tough time in Uhud and the munafiqun got caught in the crossfire, they said, يقولون هل لنا من الأمر من شيء? They said, do we have any authority also or what? Do we get a say in this or what? They were asking a question, but Allah didn't say يسألون. He said, يقول. They're saying it because it's actually not a genuine question. So it doesn't justify the use of the word يسألون. So by using the word يقولون, it's actually Allah distinguishing when is a question literally a question and when is a question rhetorically looks like a question but it's not really a question. And that can be used for good or bad reasons. In this case, it's being used for a bad reason. Because examples are about education, let's take this into the classroom so you can understand. I've been teaching many, many years, and students of all kinds have questions. There's a student who says, Ustad, question number 5, I didn't get it. Okay, let's go over it again. Let me help you go through that again. Okay, I explained it. Another student, Ustad, I don't understand. Okay, let me explain it. Yeah, I still don't understand. What did you say? What was that? What? And I could tell from his face, he's not asking a question. He's trolling me. He's trolling me. There's a difference between the student who asks a question and the student who asks a question for other reasons than curiosity, other reasons than actually learning. You understand? Actually, questions can be a really good way of insulting someone. It's a very easy way to insult someone. Are you really saying that? Are you serious right now? You know, by the way, questions can be a way of intimidating somebody too. أَنْتَ مِنَ اللاعبين? When Ibrahim a.s. said, I'm going to take revenge from your idols, you know what the people said to him? They said, are you playing? You're playing, right? Because you better be playing. Right? So they made it sound like a question. But they were actually threatening him, you better just be playing around with those words. You better not be serious. They weren't seriously asking him, are you actually playing? You understand? So when this word is used here, it's actually suggesting an attitude towards the examples. They never actually engaged with it to begin with. And Allah didn't say they say this they think, يَظُنُّونَ مَاذَا أَرَادَ اللَّهُ بِهَذَا مَثَلًا. They think, they have a thought. What does Allah mean? They don't have a thought. They come out and say it. Now the believers know it. The believers know it, which means they didn't express it. They're going through an internal thing. But when the disbeliever says it, are they the only ones who heard it? No, others heard it too. Others heard it too. And let's say, especially in this context of Surah Al-Baqarah, the disbelievers that are being kind of pinpointed are the knowledgeable members of the Jewish community in Medina. So the scholarly authorities. The scholarly authority that everybody looked at in the city as the sheikh, the alim, the mufti, the intellectual. He comes out and says, what does he mean by this example? What kind of example is this? When he says that, everybody else that looked up to him as an intellectual, what goes on in their head? Well, if he thinks it's silly, why do I have to waste my time even considering it? His review is enough for me, right? Nowadays, you guys can understand that by means of product reviews. You have some experts in tech or some experts in cars or some experts in cooking or whatever else, and you follow their channel or whatever, and he says, this product, 0.5 stars. This product, 5 stars, go get it. And you don't do fact-checking of their review. You're like, this guy said 5 stars, I'm going to get it. This guy said don't buy it, I'm not going to buy it. You see what I'm saying? We have this inclination to hand over our opinion to the expert. So if the supposed expert comes out and says, this is a joke, this has no purpose, what possible meaning could there be? What possibly could Allah intend with an example such as this? With this as an example. And by the way, هذا مثلا is tamyiz. And if you say هذا المثل with a lam, هذا المثل, it would mean, what does Allah mean by this example? That's different. This is actually more condescending. What does Allah mean by this, of all things, as an example? As if to say, God couldn't come up with something better to give an example of than this? This is God giving an example? And he wants me to learn from this? And when an expert talks down to something like that, an authority, a social authority, an intellectual authority talks that way, then people tend to gravitate and say, okay, well, he looked down on it. How can I? By the way, another thing I need to tell you, like Allah describes, examples are a way to describe reality. And this was something happening in Medina, right? But there's something more. Everything you learn about the Jews and the Christians and the mushrikun in the Quran are all tendencies that Muslims can have. It doesn't make us Jews and Christians and mushrikeen, but we can have some Christian flavor in our behavior, some Jewish flavor in our behavior, some mushrik flavor in our behavior, while still retaining our Islam collectively, and especially in our social practices. So is it possible that some people are really enamored by a public personality, a sheikh, a da'i, a sheikha, whoever? Like, I just take knowledge from this person because when they speak, my heart feels so good. Now that expert decided to release a YouTube video against some other body or some other thing. And this guy, you know, you're like, well, I don't have to investigate that anymore because you know who spoke against the person? He's practically the Pope. He looked down upon this person. So I don't have to have an opinion anymore because the ultimate authority has already spoken. This is actually something that will commonly occur. This is something that, this resignation to authority, this appeal to authority, it's one of the logical fallacies in philosophy, right? Somebody has a certain kind of authority, now their opinion becomes a proof by itself, right? And Muslims love doing this, by the way. They say, okay, what you're saying makes sense, but you know, I heard a sheikh say one time. I was like, okay, so if you heard a sheikh say one time, but that was a really big sheikh. Okay, yes, he was. But the problem with that kind of thinking, not to dismiss any scholar, is that when you say a person said, therefore, I need you to validate you as a bigger sheikh than that sheikh. Are you saying you're bigger than that sheikh? Is that why your argument is correct? So what makes an argument true is who's got the bigger sheikh, right? But would that work? Think about this. Would that work in the court of law? Would a lawyer come along and say, by the way, my argument, well, where'd you graduate from? Well, you know, University of Phoenix Online. But the other lawyer says, I graduated from Harvard. My argument is better because where I graduated from. Would that work in the court of law? No, it works in the court of Muslim society all the time. We're not interested in evidence. We're not interested in the argument. We're not interested in the truth. We're more interested in the authority. I don't dismiss the authority. But what makes the authority is that they're more thorough in their investigation. They're not genetically superior. They're not spiritually already elevated to be in a position of authority. That was the mistake of the Israelites. We are already the chosen. We have passed an opinion. Who are you? Who are you to have another opinion? And they can pass an opinion on Allah's word. ماذا أراد الله بهذا مثلا? What could Allah possibly mean by this as an example? Now Allah says, يُضِلُّ بِهِ كَثِيرًا. By means of this, He misguides many. This could be looked at a couple of ways. One way you could look at it is Allah gave this example almost as a test for people to see if they approach it with humility, then they will learn something from it. And if they don't want to approach it with humility and they want to be misguided and they want to dismiss it, then they're free to misinterpret or dismiss it and walk away from guidance. And Allah will allow that to happen. Allah will not force guidance on anybody. People often have this question, Quran is perfect, the word of Allah is perfect, how come people study it and they still don't become Muslim? I mean, I have the good fortune of going sometimes to conferences on Quran studies where the majority of the people that are presenting, scholars of the Quran, are all non-Muslims, or majority of them are non-Muslims. PhDs in Quranic studies, 20, 30 years of their life studying the Quran, majority of them not Muslim, right? And they're discussing the tafsir of this surah or that surah, or the historical analysis of this ayah or that ayah, and the guy's written 500 pages on a single ayah. It's impressive work. and you go want to talk to them in the break, hey, you said this in your paper or that, and I'm studying and I'm learning from the guy, and he goes, hold on, can I speak to you a little bit later? I'm going to go out with my friends and have a vodka. I'll come back and discuss the rest of the ayah of khamr with you. Right? You're like, they know more Arabic than most Muslims. They know more tafsir than most Muslims. They have more research than most Muslims, but they don't have any guidance. Well, why not? What's missing here, right? There's already from the very beginning, there's a dismissal that this can be the truth from their Rabb. يَعْلَمُونَ أَنَّهُ الْحَقِّ. There's a qualifier. أَنَّهُ الْحَقِّ مِنْ رَبِّهِمْ. From their Rabb. For the disbelievers, what could God possibly mean by this? What could possibly be a purpose out of this? So Allah says many are misguided. By the way, the scholars of a society, the intellectuals, are they the majority of a society or the minority? They're always the minority. So how come Allah is saying many are misguided? Because when the intellectual authority and the influencer, when the people at the top of the social pyramid, when they have an opinion and they broadcast their opinion, how do we know they're broadcasting their opinion? يَقُولُونَ. They're broadcasting their opinion. Does that have an impact on hundreds of thousands, millions of people? Yes, because millions of people would rather not think for themselves. Millions of people would say, look, I'm busy with work, I'm busy with my family, I'm busy with my finances, I'm busy with my drama at home. I'm not going to think about this myself. There's a professional thinker. I'm just going to go to listen to them. They did all the thinking for me. If they think it's good, it's good. If they think it's bad, it's bad. I got other things to think about. When people say most people are sheep and gullible, I don't accept that. Most people are only sheep and gullible when it comes to the religion, because the religion is a side problem in life. They're never sheep when it comes to their money. They're never sheep when it comes to their medical attention. They're never sheep when it comes to a legal problem. They're never sheep in when they're deciding where to move or where to get their kids their education. Never sheep in anything else. All of a sudden they're gullible when it comes to their deen. No. It's not that. It's just that it's not important enough for you to have to think about it yourself. I would rather somebody else do the thinking. I'll just go to them and whatever they say, I'll just go with it. Who cares? Who cares? Just move on. When something really matters to you, and you really think it has to do with your well-being, your physical well-being, your financial well-being, your security, you're not just going to say, yeah, whatever. No, let me see. What am I spending money on? How much is this? Why should I get this car? Why do you want me to take this loan? Why do you want me to buy this property here? Why? You're going to ask 1,000 questions. When it comes to your deen, I heard some sheikh say it's good enough. I heard somebody say it's good enough. So that's why many get misguided. Allah is actually teaching us through this example that unless you and I learn to become thinkers, we're going to fall into the many sheep category. Allah doesn't want an ummah of sheep. Allah wants the people that think, that critically analyze. It's one of the distinguishing features of our religion. We're not blind followers. We're thinkers. لَعَلَّكُمْ تَعْقِلُونَ, so you can think for yourselves. لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَفَكَّرُونَ, so you can deeply think. لِيَدَّبَّرُوا آيَاتِهِ, so they contemplate His ayat. Think. My goodness. Especially when it comes to examples, Allah actually emphasizes how much thought needs to be put in. How much you have to engage yourself to contemplate every single example Allah gives. As an exercise in just becoming a thinker. A believer is supposed to be a thinker. And so a believer comes to the ayah and says, it has purpose. You know what? It's not enough for them to say, it has purpose. I'm sure it has purpose. I feel good knowing there is a purpose mysteriously. I can move on. No. If it has purpose, I better find out what that purpose is. I better engage in that exploration. And that's not going to happen through... I'll turn to people who know more, but I'll do my own thinking also. On that vein, I'll tell you a true story. Recently, somebody came to me and said something really interesting, and I thought you should hear about this. It was a young lady who came up to me and she said, I really love your work, but I also hate your work. I was like, oh, that's cool. Tell me why. She goes, because I listen to you, and I learn a lot about the Quran, but the problem is then you did all the thinking for me. I didn't do any thinking. You did all the work. And so it's like, I like it, but it's not my relationship with the Quran. My relationship with the Quran is through your relationship with the Quran. I was like, you're right. You're right on the money. That is a serious problem. What's the solution? The solution is you need to study the Quran by yourself without my help. You need to read the ayat and ask your own questions and engage with the text yourself directly and document what you think it says, what you think it doesn't say, etc., etc. And then eventually listen to a lecture of mine. And even then, maybe some of your questions didn't get answered. Then also go to the tafasir, also go to other scholars, engage in an investigation. But the first step cannot be somebody else. The first step has to be you. The first step cannot be me. Maybe in the beginning, here and there. But if you really get serious, the first step has to be you. I'm just there to kind of help you along or validate some things or invalidate some things as you go, and you kind of you come to me for a little bit of help here and there, and you end up even disagreeing with me, all good. Because we're all trying to learn. But that's supposed to be the process. And that was actually a beautiful question. I thought it was a beautiful thing. Because that's actually the intent from Allah in the institution of examples. Okay, so now let's move forward. Allah says, وَمَا يُضِلُّ بِهِ إِلَّا الْفَاسِقِينَ. But I was going to give you other examples too of يَقُولُون being sarcastic. Like يَقُولُون فَمِنْهُمْ مَنْ يَقُول أَيُّكُمْ زَادَتْهُ هَذِهِ إِيمَانًا. Among them is those who say, who of you heard this and their iman increased? Who of you, through this verse, their faith enhanced? They're not really asking a question, they're making a sarcastic comment. So that يَقُول is in that vein, right? Okay. Now, Allah says, وَيَهْدِي بِهِ كَثِيرًا. He guides many with it. Who did He mention first? Those He allows to be misguided. He's given this book as guidance, but a misuse of this book, and you are free to be misguided. And what's the only difference? Mindset. It's the only humility. Humility to the word, or a pompous rejection of the word. That's the only difference. And then He says, Now, as I read this ayah, I start getting nervous. Well, if Allah allows many people to be misguided with the Quran, then how do I know I'm not one of them? And then He says He guides many also with it. But how do I know if I'm going to be in the right camp? In fact, in many Muslim countries, where I come from in Pakistan, neighboring country, huge population in India, in Bangladesh, in Nepal, many of these South Asian countries, we learn growing up, don't read the Quran yourself. You're going to get misguided. You need to master usul al-fiqh, sharia, aqidah, usul. There's a long list of ulum before you even open a page of the Quran. Other than that, just recite it for barakah, right? That's what you learn, right? And otherwise, you're going to be misguided. And when you read that, you're like, oh, you're reading Quran by yourself, you're going to be misguided. You're going to be misguided. When the Quran came, even the jinns were commenting on the Quran without getting an ijazah in fiqh. In the Quran, right? And the Quran is telling us about young men who didn't have any prophet, who just said there's a single God, and they ran off into a cave, and they're heroes in the Quran with no ijazat, right? But now we have to go through 18 filters before we even open the book. That's the new standard, right? So we misinform the public to say, don't engage with the Quran, you're going to be misguided. No, you will be misguided if you come to it with the wrong attitude. With the wrong attitude. I should come to the book with humility, looking for answers. And when I get questions, I should go to those who know more than me and seek their help, and continue to seek their help, but still continue to ask questions. That's what's supposed to happen. That's how I'll know I'm not falling in the first category. But then there's another safety filter in this ayah. Allah says, وَمَا يُضِلُّ بِهِ إِلَّا الْفَاسِقِينَ. Just when I was wondering, He allows many to be misguided, many to be guided. Allah says, by the way, He does not allow anybody to be misguided by these examples, except those that are fasiqeen, the corrupt. The corrupt. Now, this is really cool. I've said this enough times, but I don't get tired of saying it. There's two versions of the word corrupt in Arabic. Fasid with a dal, and fasiq with a qaf. And the fasiq with a qaf, fasaqa, is actually used for when the goo on the inside of a fruit, kharajat min qishriha, when it comes out from the shell. So if an apple is bad, but it looks good, but only when you open it, you find it's rotten on the inside, it's fasid with a dal. But if you look at the apple, it's already gooey. It's got the brown spot on it, you can stick your finger in it. That's fasiq. That's fasiq. So fasiq actually means a corrupt person whose corruption is no longer hidden, it's actually come out, it's exposed. A fasid could be a person who's corrupt, but their corruption is not very well known. It's embedded, it's hidden. That's the difference between fasiq and fasid. By the way, for food also, you can say ta'amun fasid and ta'amun fasiq. Labanun fasid, labanun fasiq. If the milk is fasid, it looks good, and then you drink it and you find out. But if the laban is fasiq, it's turned green already. So you already know, oh, inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. Right? Okay? That would be fasiq and fasid. Allah says, the only people who Allah allows to be misguided, even though they're engaging with the examples, are the fasiqeen. And so Allah is taking us in a very different direction. This is going to take about 10 minutes for me to explain, no longer, and I'll call it a night. But please pay attention to this. Usually, when you don't understand something, you are missing something called prerequisites. If you don't understand multiplication, maybe you don't understand some basic mathematics. So if you go back to the basics and build back again, and then you'll be able to understand multiplication. And maybe you need multiplication first before you can get into division, etc., etc. So you need prerequisites. If you're having a hard time with accounting 301, maybe you should have paid more attention in accounting 201 before you jumped into accounting 301. Make sense? Right? So when you don't understand something, or you're lost engaging with something, usually the problem is an intellectual deficiency, a knowledge deficiency. The Quran is pointing out that people are not able to get guidance from these ayat, but He's not saying the problem is a knowledge deficiency. The problem is a moral deficiency. The problem is a spiritual deficiency. The problem is a character deficiency, not an intellectual deficiency. Why did Allah say that? Allah was talking to ulama of Bani Israel who have zero knowledge deficiency. In fact, they were extremely intellectual. In fact, they were so intellectual, they recognized the Rasul of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam as well as they would recognize their own children. كَمَا يَعْرِفُونَ أَبْنَاءَهُم. They recognize. Knowledge was not the problem. Something else is the problem. So when we go around telling the ummah needs knowledge, the ummah needs knowledge, the ummah needs knowledge, bro, what Quran are you reading? We don't just need knowledge. We don't just need knowledge. There needs to be knowledge education, but there needs to be character building also. Give it whatever name you want to give it. Call it tazkiyah, call it tarbiyah, call it akhlaq, whatever you want to call it. But there needs to be character transformation. And that's not the same as education. Let's be real about this. How many youth here ever been to Sunday school? Sunday school? Okay, some of you have done time. Okay. All right, so you've been to Sunday school, you have a 1 hour lesson on akhlaq, kindness to parents, respect for elders, etc., etc. You're learning about manners. You're learning about it. That's still education. And then you get a true-false question or a quiz at the end. And there's a kid who got 100 on the test, on the akhlaq test. On the akhlaq test. And that same kid is bullying other kids in the break, and that same kid is talking back to the teacher, and that same kid is yelling at his mother, even though he got 100 on the what test? The akhlaq test. But they're teaching akhlaq. How come he's not? Because we still think that character will come through knowledge. Just the moment you have knowledge, everything will be good. Who said? Who said? Iblis didn't have knowledge? Iblis is pretty knowledgeable. He's got a lot of knowledge of history. He was actually there. I think he knows the story of Adam alayhi salam better than you and me, because he was part of the story. He knows the seerah better than you and I. Why? Because he was there. He was there. He knows the stories of the prophets better than any of us can. He knows the angels better than we do. Why? He's hung out with them before. There's no shortage of knowledge. As we study Surah Al-Baqarah, we'll find Allah will acknowledge the depth of the knowledge of the Israelites. The depth of their knowledge. In fact, one of the names of them in the Quran is Al-Ahbar. Not in this surah, in another surah, Al-Ahbar. Al-Ahbar comes from Hibr, which means ink. Which means they spend their entire lives opening up scrolls and closing scrolls, and their fingers are always covered in ink. These are people of ink, right? That's how much knowledge they have. With that in mind, understand what is Allah saying about people who will not be able to benefit from the examples in the Quran, from the lessons of the Quran. Who will be these people? Al-Fasiqeen. Let's figure out who they are. Allah will give us the definition in the next ayah. الَّذِينَ يَنْقُضُونَ عَهْدَ اللَّهِ مِنْ بَعْدِ مِيثَاقِهِ. Those who violate the promise made with Allah even after it had been made binding. Whoa. We already made a promise with Allah and it was already binding, and Allah says there are people who break that promise, and I'm sitting there going, what promise did I make? I didn't make a promise. What promise is this referring to? And then you find a couple of ayat later, the story of Adam begins. And by the end of that story, Allah says, فَإِمَّا يَأْتِيَنَّكُم مِّنِّي هُدًى فَمَن تَبِعَ هُدَايَ فَلَا خَوْفٌ عَلَيْهِمْ وَلَا هُمْ يَحْزَنُونَ وَالَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا وَكَذَّبُوا بِآيَاتِنَا أُولَٰئِكَ أَصْحَابُ النَّارِ هُمْ فِيهَا خَالِدُونَ. Whoever follows my guidance will have no fear or shall not grieve. And whoever denies and calls my revelations a lie, those are the people in hellfire, in which they will remain. There was a binding agreement taken from the story of Adam alayhi salam applying to all of his children, including ourselves, and Allah is saying that is the agreement that still holds for every human being. Whenever I send guidance, you'll take it seriously. The first definition of the corrupt is they don't care about their relationship with the guidance of Allah. Listen to me carefully about this one. If you remember nothing else, I know that's easy for you to remember nothing else. Just remember this one. Our relationship with Allah is equal to our relationship with the guidance sent by Allah. I'll say that again. Our relationship with Allah is equal to our relationship with the guidance sent by Allah. الَّذِينَ يَنْقُضُونَ عَهْدَ اللَّهِ مِنْ بَعْدِ مِيثَاقِهِ. And the guidance is many things, but then Allah says, by the way, the most important parts of that guidance, what are they? وَيَقْطَعُونَ مَا أَمَرَ اللَّهُ بِهِ أَنْ يُوصَلَ. They cut what Allah commands to keep joined. Very simple. Who will not benefit from the examples? People who cut what Allah commanded to keep joined. First of all, cutting the example from its purpose. Allah commanded it to be joined. Cutting the ayat from the surah to which they belong. Allah kept that to be joined. Many Sahaba, many Tabi'een, many ulama commented on this ayah and they said what? They cut between Allah and His Messenger. I want to listen to Allah, I don't want to listen to His Messenger. Others said, and this is a very common understanding of this ayah, it's reinforced by other places in the Quran, they cut family relations. People who can't even respect the bonds of family will not be able to respect the bond they have with Allah. In fact, in the Quran, the taqwa of Allah and the taqwa of family relations are put next to each other. وَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ الَّذِي تَسَاءَلُونَ بِهِ وَالْأَرْحَامِ. So just like we must not disconnect our relationship with Allah, the biggest proof of that is we must not disconnect our relationship with families. Now Allah is saying, if you step back, something we could never have known. We cannot understand the ayat of the Quran, the examples sent by Allah, if we don't honor the rights that are made by Allah within our families. You think these are unrelated subjects. They have nothing to do with each other. What does family relations have to do with contemplating the Quran? Allah says, yeah, you don't know how that works. I do. Because the family relations would be a different class, and contemplating the examples of the Quran would be a different class. Allah says, no, that's all the same class. You don't have the brain capacity to know that these two things go together. The only one who could have told you that these two things have an integral relationship with each other is Allah. وَيُعَلِّمُكُم مَا لَمْ تَكُونُوا تَعْلَمُونَ. He teaches you what you couldn't have known yourselves. We only know how to make logical connections between things from the way we can see them, but Allah knows about connections between things that we cannot perceive. That is one of those connections. I could see some logic to it too. Allahu A'lam, the complete wisdom. But some logic makes total sense. If someone doesn't even abide by the closest relationships they have that Allah put in their fitrah, they don't honor their mother, their father, they don't give the rights of their children, they have no rahmah in them. You know how the Rasul says, "Man la yarham la yurham," the one who doesn't show rahmah will not be shown rahmah, right? If If they're that kind of person, that means they're not grateful for the closest blessings they have, their own family. If a person can't even be grateful for the seen, how will they ever be grateful and humble to the unseen? That's impossible. This is why Allah put worship of Allah right next to goodness to parents. Because if you can't even be good to your parents, how are you going to, they're the ones who raised you and you can't even show them humility. How are you going to show humility to the Rabb who you can't even see? That doesn't make any sense. So Allah says, وَيَقْطَعُونَ مَا أَمَرَ اللَّهُ بِهِ أَن يُوصَلَ وَيُفْسِدُونَ فِي الْأَرْضِ. And they'll cause corruption in the land. These are the people. Now we get to the last part of this introduction. And that is that when people don't engage with these examples and they don't understand reality for what it is, then they will end up, the kind of people they are, not only do they violate family, they create corruption in the world. Take 2 minutes to contemplate that. When people break families, when children are not taken care of, for example, when fathers abandon their children, for example, when parents don't do their responsibility raising their children, when husbands violate the rights of the wife, when wife violates the rights of the husband, what happens to the next generation? What happens in societies where there's a huge number of, for example, single moms and the dads have disappeared into the universe? What happens within a decade to those 5-year-olds that are now 15 years old? Drugs, alcohol, prostitution, gang-related crime. Does corruption increase in the world because families are breaking down? Ask any judge who's retired in any city in the world that's dealing with youth, juvenile court. Ask them, what do you think is the root problem? Family. Every time. Across the world. It's not a government policy, it's not education. The real problem in the corruption of society is what? Family. وَيَقْطَعُونَ مَا أَمَرَ اللَّهُ بِهِ أَن يُوصَلَ وَيُفْسِدُونَ فِي الْأَرْضِ. In 2 phrases, Allah described an economic reality, a social reality, a political reality that plagues the entire world. How many billions of dollars are spent fighting drugs, alcohol addiction, teen suicides, all kinds of problems among the young generation that is susceptible to crime and to create problems in the world, and all coming from just one little وَيَقْطَعُونَ مَا أَمَرَ اللَّهُ بِهِ أَن يُوصَلَ وَيُفْسِدُونَ فِي الْأَرْضِ. And then Allah says about, in the end, أُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْخَاسِرُونَ. So amazing that Allah said, those are the ultimate losers. Keep the word losers in mind, because right after is the story of Adam alayhi salam, and he's begging Allah, رَبَّنَا ظَلَمْنَا أَنفُسَنَا وَإِن لَمْ تَغْفِرْ لَنَا وَتَرْحَمْنَا لَنَكُونَنَّ مِنَ الْخَاسِرِينَ. He's going to say that in Surah Al-A'raf. Right? SubhanAllah. Like, he's already, he's setting the ground, he's laying the groundwork for what's coming in the story of humanity in these ayat. So having laid this introduction for what makes these stories so incredible, or these examples so incredible,